The air after that day at the lagoon didn't feel the same anymore. It wasn't something I noticed immediately. At first, everything still looked like it always had, the same trees leaning over the hidden water, the same quiet ripple where sunlight fractured across the surface like broken glass. Even the path back through the brush felt familiar under my shoes. But something inside me had shifted in a way I didn't yet have words for. Zane walked slightly ahead of me on the return trip, brushing leaves aside with his hand like nothing unusual had happened at all. That alone confused me more than anything. I kept waiting for him to say something, to joke, to laugh, to acknowledge what had just occurred between us, but he didn't. He just moved forward, calm and unbothered, as if we had simply gone swimming and nothing more. I followed him in silence, my thoughts tangled and heavy. The Vespa was still where we left it, half hidden in the shrubs. The familiar sight of it should have grounded me, but it didn't. When I touched the handlebars, my hands felt strangely disconnected, like they belonged to someone else. Zane swung his backpack over his shoulder. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked casually. His voice was normal. Too normal. I hesitated. "Yeah," I said finally, though my throat felt tight. He gave a short nod like that was all that needed to be said, then turned away and walked toward the edge of the park. I watched him go until the trees swallowed him. Only then did I sit down on the seat of the Vespa and breathe. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling of my small room, listening to the house creak in the quiet. My mother's voice drifted faintly through the walls earlier in the evening, talking to my aunt downstairs, laughing at something I didn't understand. Everything outside my room felt normal. Inside, nothing was. I kept replaying the lagoon in fragments, not the way it looked, but the way I felt in it. The confusion. The heat of embarrassment I couldn't separate from curiosity. The strange pull between fear and trust. The way Zane had looked at me afterward, like he was waiting for me to react, and the way I hadn't known how. At one point I pressed my forearm over my eyes, trying to block it out. But the thoughts didn't leave. Instead, they twisted into questions I couldn't answer. Was I supposed to feel something specific? Was this friendship? Was it something else? Or was I just broken in a way I hadn't understood yet? I had no language for any of it. Back then, I didn't even know such language existed. The next day at school felt like walking through a place that had been slightly rearranged while I wasn't looking. The halls were the same. The lockers still slammed shut with metallic echoes. The fluorescent lights still buzzed faintly overhead. But I noticed everything differently now, like I was observing from just outside my own body. I saw Zane at lunch. He was sitting with a few of the others from our group, the so-called Losers Club, though we never called it that in front of anyone else. They were laughing about something on a phone screen. Zane laughed too, easy and relaxed, leaning back in his chair like nothing weighed on him at all. When his eyes briefly met mine across the cafeteria, he gave a quick nod. Just that. No tension. No awkwardness. No change. It unsettled me more than anything else could have. Because I wasn't the same. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that nothing had changed. I still went to school. Still trained with the lacrosse team. Still rode my Vespa home through the same streets, feeling the wind push against my jacket. But my attention kept slipping. In class, I would find myself staring at the edge of my desk instead of the board. Conversations passed through me like water through mesh. Even when I spoke, I felt like I was listening to someone else use my voice. And every afternoon, I felt the same pull toward the park. I didn't go back immediately. Part of me was afraid to. Not of Zane, but of myself. Of what I might feel, or not feel, or feel too strongly. So I avoided it. For 3 days, I took different routes home. Longer routes. Slower routes. Anything that kept me away from the trees and the hidden water. But avoidance has a limit. And silence has weight. On the 4th day, Zane showed up at my usual meeting spot near the Vespa. He didn't say anything at first. He just leaned against a tree with his arms crossed, watching me arrive. "Been busy?" he asked. There was no accusation in his tone. Only curiosity. I shrugged, trying to act normal. "Yeah, school stuff." He nodded like he accepted that without question. Then he kicked a small rock across the dirt. "You're still coming today though, right?" It wasn't a demand. Not exactly. But it wasn't optional either. I hesitated too long. That was enough for him to notice. He studied me for a second, then gave a half smile. "You're thinking too much about it," he said simply. I didn't answer. Because I didn't know what it was. Or maybe I did, and that was the problem. We rode to the park in silence. The Vespa hummed beneath us, familiar and steady, but I couldn't relax the way I usually did when Zane sat behind me. The distance between us felt different now. Not physical. Something subtler. Like the air itself remembered more than I did. When we reached the hidden trail, Zane got off first. He didn't wait for me this time. He just started walking in. I followed. The lagoon was exactly the same. Still. Green-blue. Surrounded by dense canopy that blocked out most of the outside world. The place felt untouched by anything that happened beyond it. Zane dropped his bag near a log. Then he turned back toward me. For the first time since that day, the silence between us felt heavy. Not uncomfortable exactly. Just full. "I thought you weren't coming back," he said. "I didn't know if I should," I admitted. He nodded slowly, like that made sense. Then he sat down on the log. "I wasn't sure either," he said. That surprised me. Zane didn't usually sound unsure about anything. I looked at him carefully, trying to read what he wasn't saying. But he just stared at the water like it held the answer to something. Finally, he added, "Things don't have to mean more than they are." I didn't know if he meant it as reassurance or warning. Maybe both. I sat down beside him. We didn't talk for a while. The lagoon rippled gently in front of us, indifferent to everything happening in my head. I wanted clarity. A definition. A rule book for what we had crossed into. But Zane didn't offer one. And maybe he didn't have one either. What he did have was certainty about not needing one. I didn't. That was how the next phase of my life began. Not with answers. But with silence that demanded I learn how to carry it. The days after that felt like I was living inside a version of my life that had been quietly misaligned. Everything still functioned the way it always had: school bells, homework sheets, locker doors slamming shut, but I moved through it like a shadow that didn't quite match the body casting it. Zane didn't avoid me. That was the strange part. If anything, he acted more normal than before. Easier. Looser. Like he had filed whatever had happened between us into a drawer and locked it shut. But I couldn't. I kept finding myself thinking in fragments, moments, sensations, half-formed questions that dissolved the second I tried to hold them. And the worst part was not knowing whether I was supposed to forget it, or understand it. So I did what I had always done when things became too loud inside my head. I retreated. The library was the only place in school that didn't demand anything from me. No one expected you to perform there. No one cared if you were popular, loud, athletic, or invisible. It was just rows of books and the soft, constant hum of people trying not to disturb each other. I started going there more often after lunch. At first, it was accidental. I would drift in to avoid the noise outside, the teasing, the pushing, the constant pressure of being seen in ways I didn't understand or agree with. But over time, it became deliberate. A choice. Inside, I could breathe. There was a corner table near the back where a small group of students always sat. I didn't know all the names at first. Just faces, quiet ones, tired ones, ones that looked like they belonged nowhere else in the building. They didn't ask questions when I sat near them. That was the beginning of everything. Zane noticed my absence quickly. He always noticed things like that. On the second week, he found me there during lunch, leaning against the end of my table like he had been looking for me without fully admitting it. "You've been hiding," he said. "I've been busy," I replied automatically. He gave me a look that said he didn't believe that for a second. Then he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down anyway. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Around us, the library kept breathing quietly. Finally, he said, "You don't need to disappear just because things feel weird." I didn't answer right away. Because I wasn't sure what I had disappeared from. Or into. "I'm not disappearing," I said eventually. Zane raised an eyebrow slightly. "You are," he replied simply. That was the end of that conversation. But it stayed with me long after he walked away. The bullying started changing around the same time. Before, it had been loud and obvious: shoves in hallways, insults thrown like stones, laughter that followed me down corridors. Now it became more targeted. More deliberate. It was no longer just random cruelty. It felt organized, like I had become a known object in a system of attention. The words didn't change much, but the intent did. Faggot. Freak. Weirdo. Words I tried not to absorb, but they still sank in through the cracks. What changed most wasn't the insults. It was the people. Some of the kids I had once sat with, people who had laughed in the library, who had been part of that quiet losers club space, started drifting away from me in the halls. At first it was subtle. They stopped sitting near me. Stopped waiting for me after class. Stopped acknowledging me in the same way. Then it became clear. They were choosing distance. Safety by association. And I couldn't even blame them. That was the part that hurt the most. Zane didn't drift. If anything, he became more present. But differently. Less like a friend, more like a constant. He still met me by the Vespa sometimes after school. Still walked part of the way with me. Still talked like nothing had changed. But there was a new edge in the way he spoke. A kind of certainty that I didn't have anymore. "You think too much," he said one afternoon as we sat near the park fence. "I don't think enough," I muttered back. He smirked. "That's not your problem." I looked at him. "Then what is it?" He shrugged. "You just care what things mean. Most people don't." I didn't know how to respond to that. Because part of me agreed. And part of me felt accused. The park became a strange middle space in my life. Not school. Not home. Not fully safe. But not fully unsafe either. It was where Zane and I still met, though the lagoon felt different now. Less like a secret world and more like something we had outgrown without admitting it. Sometimes we would sit there in silence for hours. Other times we would talk about random things, school, other people, small pointless observations that didn't require emotional honesty. But the deeper conversations never returned. They stayed buried under whatever had shifted between us. At home, my mother noticed I was quieter. She always noticed things like that too, though she didn't always ask directly. "You eating enough?" she would say while passing my room. "Yeah," I would reply. "You seem tired." "School." That was usually enough to end it. She had her own life now in California, her sister nearby, my cousin Bethany occasionally over, the house always filled with some kind of background noise I didn't fully belong to. I wasn't unhappy there. But I wasn't anchored either. I existed in it like a guest who had overstayed without being asked to leave. High school started tightening around me. What had once felt manageable now felt structured in a way I couldn't ignore. Hallways became narrower. Interactions more loaded. Every movement felt observed. Even lacrosse, something I had joined to feel stronger, more physical, more present in my own body, started to feel distant. I still played. I still ran drills. But I wasn't fully inside it anymore. Like I was watching myself perform from a few steps back. The library became my only stable point. And over time, I realized I wasn't the only one who used it that way. There were others. A boy who always drew in the margins of his notebooks. A girl who read the same book over and over like it was the only one she trusted. A group of quiet students who never spoke loudly even when they laughed. We didn't form friendships in the traditional sense. It was more like shared survival. We existed in proximity, not connection. And yet, that was enough. Someone eventually joked about it, about how we were all the losers of the school, hiding in books instead of the cafeteria chaos. The name stuck. The Losers Club. It wasn't official. But it didn't need to be. It was understood. Zane didn't really belong to that space. Not fully. He visited it, but he wasn't shaped by it in the same way I was. Where I softened into silence, he sharpened into confidence. Where I withdrew, he expanded. It wasn't that he was unaffected by life. It was that he processed it differently. And over time, I began to realize something uncomfortable. He was becoming someone I didn't entirely recognize anymore. Not because he changed overnight, but because I was finally seeing him without the filter of dependence. One afternoon, he met me after school near the Vespa again. But this time, he didn't lean against the tree casually. He stood there waiting, arms loose at his sides, watching me arrive. "You're slipping away," he said. I frowned slightly. "What does that even mean?" He tilted his head. "You're not where you used to be." I felt a defensive reaction rise in me. "I'm still here." He shook his head. "That's not what I mean." I didn't respond. Because I didn't understand what he meant either. Or maybe I did. And didn't want to admit it. That night, I lay awake again. But this time it wasn't confusion about one moment. It was confusion about everything that had built up around it. Who I was. Who I had been. Who I was becoming. And whether any of it was actually something I chose, or something that just happened to me while I was trying to survive everything else. For the first time, I didn't think in single memories. I thought in patterns. Isolation. Adaptation. Survival. And underneath all of it, a growing sense that I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't yet name. By the time I noticed how bad things had gotten, it was already normal to everyone else. That's how it always starts, slow enough that you adapt instead of react. The bullying wasn't just background noise anymore. It had become part of the structure of my days, like the timetable or the bell schedule. I knew where it would happen, who would be there, what version of myself I would have to become to get through it. I stopped expecting it to stop. Instead, I started planning around it. Which hallway to take. Which group to avoid. Which teacher's classroom was safest between periods. It wasn't living anymore. It was navigation. Zane still appeared in my life like a fixed point. But even that began to change. He wasn't always waiting for me anymore. Sometimes I would find him already walking with other people. Sometimes he would nod at me but keep moving. At first I told myself it didn't mean anything. People grow. People shift. But deep down, I felt it. The distance wasn't accidental anymore. It was forming shape. One afternoon after lacrosse practice, I sat alone on the metal bench near the field, still in my sweat-soaked jersey, watching the team slowly disperse. My body felt strong in a way I couldn't emotionally access. Muscles tired. Breathing heavy. Heart steady. But inside, I felt detached from all of it. That was when one of the older guys on the team walked past and muttered something under his breath. I didn't catch the exact words. But I caught the tone. Laughter followed him. Not loud. Not obvious. Just enough. I didn't respond. I had learned by then that reacting only made things worse. So I sat still. And let it pass. The library became more crowded in a way I didn't expect. Not physically crowded, but emotionally. More people like me started appearing there, even if they didn't talk to each other. It was like a silent agreement had formed. This was the place where you came when you couldn't exist properly anywhere else. I started recognizing patterns in people the way I recognized routes in the school building. Who sat near windows? Who stayed in corners? who never made eye contact unless necessary. We were all avoiding something. Or everything. Zane came back to me properly one afternoon near the edge of the park. Not casually. Not drifting. Intentionally. He was standing by the fence when I arrived on the Vespa. "I've been thinking," he said. That already felt different. Zane didn't usually announce thinking. He acted first, explained later, or never. I cut the engine and stayed seated. "About what?" I asked. He looked toward the trees instead of me. "Us," he said simply. My stomach tightened slightly at the word. Because I didn't know what us meant anymore. Or if it had ever been stable to begin with. "There isn't really an us like that," I said carefully. He nodded once. Like he expected that answer. But he didn't accept it. "Then what is it?" he asked. I hesitated. That silence stretched longer than I wanted it to. Finally I said, "I don't know anymore." For the first time, Zane didn't immediately respond. He just stood there, looking at the trees like they might explain it for him. That was the moment something inside the friendship shifted for good. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just, irreversibly. The bullying escalated again shortly after that. But now it felt less like chaos and more like structure. There were certain students who had clearly decided I was a target, and others who followed because it was easier than standing out. It stopped being about individual insults. It became social positioning. Where I stood in the hierarchy of the school. And the answer, for them, was always the same. Below. One afternoon in the hallway, I was shoved hard enough into a locker that the metal rang through my bones. Laughter followed immediately. I didn't fall. But I didn't retaliate either. I just stood there for a second afterward, breathing slowly, waiting for the moment to pass. A teacher walked by. Saw nothing. Or chose to see nothing. That part one never figured out. At home, I started spending more time in my room. Not because I was grounded. But because the outside world felt increasingly like something I had to brace for. My mother tried to talk to me more during this period. She would knock softly on the doorframe. Ask how school was. Ask if I wanted to come eat. I always said yes. Or fine. Or later. Anything that kept the conversation short. Because I didn't know how to explain what was happening inside me without making it sound like something I was inventing. And I didn't trust myself enough yet to describe it properly. Zane and I stopped meeting at the lagoon as often. We still went sometimes. But the ritual had lost its ease. What used to feel like escape now felt like avoidance. We sat more than we moved. Talked less. Watched the water more than each other. It was like we were both waiting for something to resolve itself without having to say it out loud. But it didn't resolve. It just lingered. One afternoon, Zane showed up at the Vespa again with a different expression. Not relaxed. Not distant. Focused. "You're not okay," he said bluntly. I frowned. "That's not new." He shook his head. "No. I mean really." I didn't answer immediately. Because part of me wanted to deny it. But another part was too tired to pretend. I'm managing, I said instead. He laughed once, not mocking, just short. That's not the same thing. We walked into the park without talking much. The dirt path felt longer than usual, like it was stretching on purpose. When we reached the edge of the trees, he stopped. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with you, he said. That honesty surprised me. Because Zane usually had answers, even if they weren't good ones. I looked at him. You don't have to do anything, I said. He shook his head again. That's the problem, he replied. Silence. Then, you act like you're disappearing, he said. I'm not, I insisted automatically. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure it was true anymore. That night, something changed in me that I didn't recognize until later. It wasn't a breakdown. Not exactly. More like a realization that I had been holding my life together through momentum alone. School. Friends. Sports. Routine. Remove any one of them, and I wasn't sure what was left underneath. I lay awake and tried to find a core version of myself that existed without context. But I couldn't. There were only roles. Only responses. Only survival strategies. And that scared me more than anything else had. A few weeks later, I stopped going to the lagoon entirely. Zane didn't ask why. And I didn't offer an explanation. We still saw each other, but the shape of the friendship had changed completely. Less shared space. More passing contact. Less understanding. More history. And somewhere in that slow unraveling, I started to realize something I couldn't admit at the time. I wasn't just being pushed away by other people. I was also pulling away from myself. By the time senior year started leaning toward its final stretch, it no longer felt like I was part of the school. It felt like I was passing through it. Not invisible exactly. More like temporarily tolerated, present enough to be acknowledged, but distant enough to be ignored when convenient. The Losers Club, as it had once been half-jokingly called, had already dissolved into smaller, quieter versions of itself. People drifted. That was the natural order of things I was finally learning to accept. Some of them found confidence in other groups. Some found protection. Some simply stopped showing up in the library at all, like they had graduated internally before the school ever granted them a diploma. What remained was me. And a few others who didn't have anywhere else to go. But even that was less of a group now, and more of a shared silence. Zane was still there. But not in the way he used to be. He no longer waited for me. He no longer walked beside me by default. He no longer filled the space between my thoughts the way he once had. Instead, he appeared occasionally like a reminder of something I couldn't quite categorize anymore. Sometimes we'd exchange a few words. Sometimes just a nod. Sometimes nothing at all. And strangely, all of it felt equally final. One afternoon, I saw him across the schoolyard. He was standing with a different group now, louder, more confident boys who spoke with the kind of certainty I never had. He was laughing. Not at me. Not even in a way that included me. Just existing in a different orbit. For a moment, I watched him without moving. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter. recognition that whatever version of him I had once known wasn't the full picture. Or maybe I had only ever known a small part of him to begin with. He glanced my way briefly. Our eyes met. And then he looked away first. Not harshly. Just naturally. Like closing a chapter without realizing it had a title. I didn't go to the park that week. Or the week after. At first it felt like a decision. Then it started feeling like inertia. And eventually, like absence that had become routine. Home didn't get easier. But it got quieter. My mother stopped asking as many questions. Not because she stopped caring, but because she had learned the answers I was capable of giving. I was fine. I was tired. I was just focused on school. That was the version of me she could access. Anything deeper stayed locked behind language I didn't yet have. High school, at that point, had become a system I was maintaining rather than participating in. I attended classes. Completed assignments. Passed tests. But I wasn't invested in any of it in the way I once thought I would be. There was a version of life I had expected to grow into, something clearer, more defined, more socially aligned. Instead, I felt like I had been rerouted into something quieter and more isolated. Not tragic. Just disconnected. The bullying didn't stop. It evolved. It became less physical over time, less immediate. More psychological. Whispers in corridors. Laughs that stopped when I walked by. People shifting slightly away from me in group spaces without acknowledging they were doing it. The message was the same. Just delivered more efficiently. I stopped reacting completely. Not because it didn't hurt. But because reacting didn't change anything. It only confirmed I was part of their attention. The library remained the one constant space where the social pressure loosened its grip. But even there, something had changed. We didn't form bonds the way I once imagined friendships should work. There were no defining conversations. No emotional anchors. Just presence. Shared existence in a place that required nothing more. And maybe that was enough for a while. But not forever. Zane and I had one of our last real conversations near the end of that year. It happened without planning. He was leaning against the fence near where we used to park the Vespa. I almost didn't stop. But he called out my name. Just once. So I did. I cut the engine and stayed seated. He didn't smile. He didn't look angry either. Just serious in a way that felt unfamiliar. I think we should stop meeting like this, he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded slowly. Not because I agreed immediately. But because part of me already knew this was coming. Okay, I said. He looked at me for a second longer than necessary. Like he was checking if I understood the weight of it. Then he nodded back. Yeah, he said quietly. And that was it. No argument. No explanation. No closure. Just an ending that arrived without ceremony. That night felt different from the others. Not because I was devastated. But because I realized I had been preparing for it without knowing. Loss doesn't always feel like something breaking. Sometimes it feels like something finally aligning with what it already was. After Zane, the structure of my life simplified in a strange way. There was no longer ambiguity about where I stood with him. No longer uncertainty about when I would see him. No longer the emotional reflex of waiting. What replaced it was emptiness, but an organized kind. One that didn't demand attention every day. Just occasionally reminded me it was there. Senior year moved forward anyway. Time doesn't pause for emotional transitions. It only changes speed depending on what you're experiencing inside it. Days became shorter in memory. Weeks blurred. Months passed without clear markers. I graduated without feeling like I had arrived anywhere. Only that I had completed a segment of something larger. After high school, I stayed in California. Not because it felt like home, but because leaving required more direction than I had at the time. I took small jobs. Temporary work. Things that required function rather than identity. People would ask what I wanted to do with my life. I learned to answer vaguely. I'm figuring it out. Which was both true and incomplete. The sense of being different never left. But it stopped feeling like a crisis over time. It became more like background weather. Always present. Not always disruptive. Just there. It wasn't until I was 18, technically an adult by legal definition, that anything resembling clarity entered the picture. A job application required a psychological evaluation. It wasn't meant to be meaningful. Just procedural. A checkbox. But I agreed to it anyway. Because at that point, I was used to being assessed without understanding what was being measured. The psychologist was calm in a way that made the room feel smaller. She didn't rush. She didn't react dramatically to anything I said. She just listened. Asked questions. Took notes. Waited. At the end, she didn't present my life back to me as something broken or fixed. She described patterns. Labels, in a clinical sense, but not in a judgmental one. Aromantic. Asexual spectrum. Non-binary traits. No autism. Nothing pathological. Just structure. Categories that helped explain what had once felt like internal contradiction. I remember sitting there after she spoke, not feeling transformed. Just slightly more organized inside. Like scattered pieces had been placed into labeled boxes. Not solved. But no longer random. When I left the building that day, I didn't feel like a different person. I felt like I had finally been given permission to stop interpreting myself as an error. Not everything made sense. But it didn't have to be forced into meaning anymore either. And for the first time in a long time, I thought about Zane without confusion or pain. Just memory. Not resolution. Not regret. Just something that had existed, shaped me, and then moved on. But because I realized I had been preparing for it without knowing. Loss doesn't always feel like something breaking. Sometimes it feels like something finally aligning with what it already was. After Zane, the structure of my life simplified in a strange way. There was no longer ambiguity about where I stood with him. No longer uncertainty about when I would see him. No longer the emotional reflex of waiting. What replaced it was emptiness, but an organized kind. One that didn't demand attention every day. Just occasionally reminded me it was there. Senior year moved forward anyway. Time doesn't pause for emotional transitions. It only changes speed depending on what you're experiencing inside it. Days became shorter in memory. Weeks blurred. Months passed without clear markers. I graduated without feeling like I had arrived anywhere. Only that I had completed a segment of something larger. After high school, I stayed in California. Not because it felt like home, but because leaving required more direction than I had at the time. I took small jobs. Temporary work. Things that required function rather than identity. People would ask what I wanted to do with my life. I learned to answer vaguely. I'm figuring it out. Which was both true and incomplete. The sense of being different never left. But it stopped feeling like a crisis over time. It became more like background weather. Always present. Not always disruptive. Just there. It wasn't until I was 18, technically an adult by legal definition, that anything resembling clarity entered the picture. A job application required a psychological evaluation. It wasn't meant to be meaningful. Just procedural. A checkbox. But I agreed to it anyway. Because at that point, I was used to being assessed without understanding what was being measured. The psychologist was calm in a way that made the room feel smaller. She didn't rush. She didn't react dramatically to anything I said. She just listened. Asked questions. Took notes. Waited. At the end, she didn't present my life back to me as something broken or fixed. She described patterns. Labels, in a clinical sense, but not in a judgmental one. Aromantic. Asexual spectrum. Non-binary traits. No autism. Nothing pathological. Just structure. Categories that helped explain what had once felt like internal contradiction. I remember sitting there after she spoke, not feeling transformed. Just slightly more organized inside. Like scattered pieces had been placed into labeled boxes. Not solved. But no longer random. When I left the building that day, I didn't feel like a different person. I felt like I had finally been given permission to stop interpreting myself as an error. Not everything made sense. But it didn't have to be forced into meaning anymore either. And for the first time in a long time, I thought about Zane without confusion or pain. Just memory. Not resolution. Not regret. Just something that had existed, shaped me, and then moved on. He adapted with limited information. That reframing changed everything quietly. My relationship with my mother also softened over time. Not through dramatic reconciliation, but through distance becoming less emotionally charged. She never fully understood the internal complexity of my adolescence. But she didn't need to. She understood enough to see that I was no longer drowning in it. That was enough for her. And for me, eventually, it was enough that she stopped trying to fix what wasn't broken in the way she assumed. There were still moments of loneliness. That never disappeared completely. But it changed shape. It was no longer the sharp, consuming isolation of high school. It became something softer. Manageable. A reminder of difference rather than a punishment for it. And sometimes, very rarely, I would pass by a park or a wooded area and feel a strange sense of déjà vu. Not longing. Not regret. Just memory encoded in the body before language existed to explain it. A feeling of water, trees, silence, and two versions of myself that had once existed in a world I no longer lived in. I never went back to those places. Not because I was afraid, but because there was no need to. They lived in a completed part of my life now. If there was a final realization, it came quietly and late. Not as insight, but as acceptance. I was not meant to be defined by the confusion of my teenage years. I was meant to pass through them and come out the other side with enough understanding to stop turning my past into a verdict. Zane remained what he had always been in memory. Not a symbol. Not a lesson. Not a label. But a person who existed at a very specific intersection of time, environment, and emotional immaturity, just like I did. We met there. We changed each other. And then we left. That was all. And somehow, that was enough. In the end, I stopped asking what I was supposed to be. Because life didn't answer that question. It only responded to what I chose to continue carrying. And I chose, finally, to carry only what didn't destroy me.